Hi, this is Dr. Wendy Smith on Awakened Nation with Brad Solis.
A huge shift is taking place on planet Earth. People seem to be waking up. Tired of the way things used to be, they are creating something brand new and changing the world we live in. My name is Brad Solis, and I get to sit down with the next generation of idea makers, the disruptors, and the game changers. Everyday people, just like you and me, from all over, who are doing amazing things to Awakened Nation. Ladies and gentlemen, I have an amazing guest on today. If you're into true crime, you're into what's happening in childhood, what's happening in our society, you're going to love today's episode. I have with me Dr. Wendy Smith. Welcome to Awaken Nation.
Thank you so much. So glad to be here.
I'm going to read your bio real quick. Adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, the bad things that happen to children during their formative years, have been in the limelight of late, most recently as regards the Menendez brothers and their request for resentencing. My guest today is Dr. Wendy Smith, who holds a PhD and an LCSW, basically a master's degree in social work, is a retired clinical professor of social work, and was Associate Dean of Curriculum Development and Assessment at the University of Southern California, Suzanne Dvorak Peck School of Social Work, where she taught courses on child, adolescent development. And she is a licensed clinical social worker who maintained a private practice in psychotherapy in Los Angeles for 35 years. Today, we're going to talk about why would a child commit such terrible crimes, the impact of toxic stress, and our stress response systems, the context in which we grow, and what is needed to heal trauma. She is also the author of Before Their Crimes, What We're Misunderstanding About Childhood Trauma, Youth Crime, and the Path to Healing. I'm excited to have you on the show today. I know this is a dark subject, but the only way we can heal this is if we can discuss what causes it. Welcome to Awaken Nation, Dr. Smith.
Thank you. Where would you like me to start?
Well, what got you involved in this? I know it takes a certain type of person with a wonderful heart to become a social worker, but to take it to this other level, to find out the triggers, what is causing some of this behavior, what made you go down this path? And I mean, initially you go down the path because you love people, but there's this other thing that comes along as you're studying. You're like, well, why is this happening? Let's start there.
Okay, that's a great question because you're right. I had been in the field of social work for many years, my whole career really. And in about 2014, so about 10 years ago, I was asked to join a group of lawyers and advocates who were meeting with people who were incarcerated for crimes they committed when they were children or
Mhm.
juveniles, and to explain to them the changes in California law that recognized the difference between children's brains and adult brains, basically. And
Mhm.
that if you committed your crime when you were a child, your decision making and judgment were not what they would have been had it been 10 years later. So we were visiting prisons to explain this law, and my role as a mental health practitioner was to meet with groups of prisoners in what we call the insight discussions to explain to them that they would need to really develop insight into their crimes and to try to understand what it might have been that they experienced early in life that led to the moment of violent crime. It was in the course of those meetings and hearing from these men, and then also, and women as well. We went to some women's prisons, but it was a particular meeting with a prisoner at Pelican Bay, which is, you may know, a maximum security prison where we house some of the most serious offenders.
Right.
And we entered you know, what they call the security housing unit, known as solitary, where
Right.
people may be in solitary confinement for many years, I had the opportunity to meet with one individual separately. I mean, there were guards present, but no other prisoners. And he began to speak to me about his childhood and his early experiences. And we were both in tears by the time he finished speaking to me about what had happened to him as a child. So after that meeting, I really began to think about the impact of early experience and its role in crimes that young people commit. And that
Yeah.
kind of started me researching and deciding to interview a larger group of people, men and women, who had committed, many of them, very violent crimes when they were under 18.
I find it fascinating because you did talk about this in the book, especially in the beginning, where you went into the prisons and you did
Yes.
the research. It reminds me of the TV series on Netflix, Mind Hunters, and this stuck out to me. And those of you listening, this is the reason we now have people like Dr. Wendy Smith doing this kind of work in this series. It's based on how the FBI changed their ability or their methodology for finding new criminals, because before the 1950s crime was simple. If someone caught their wife cheating, they would get a gun and shoot the guy, or if they robbed a bank. It was simple. It was methodical. But somewhere around the late 50s, early 60s, they started to see murders that made no sense. So they had to change their tactics. And one of the things they did, you're going to love this, they went into the prisons. And although this was a TV show, they used the actual footage and the scripts and things where they interviewed famous murderers who had been traumatized in childhood. And it was astounding because the show tried to recreate. They went in and interviewed Son of Sam, they interviewed Charlie Manson, and they started to form this data where they could start to now look for these killers based on new information, a new type of person. And I hate to say, they're murderers, all this, but going back and looking at that childhood trauma can help us avoid these types of situations. Am I correct in that assessment a little bit?
I think you're correct in that understanding what happens to children early on, there are many points where we could intervene that
Hmm.
we don't. And I think that series and things like my book help us pay
Yeah,
attention to the importance of the good things and the bad things that happen to children. There are
yeah,
so many moments where we could make a difference.
yeah.
And I think that was a very important piece of what that show brings to us.
I think the issue is as a child, because I've had some trauma as well in childhood, and I've worked very hard to, heal that. The feeling is powerlessness. That's number one. And a child, in our tiny brains, we try to figure out why this is happening, what is happening, how can we escape it. And when you don't have the physical power to escape it, you endure it.
That's
And,
right.
and what does that do to the psyche? It kind of makes the person enraged at a certain part of them. Am I correct on that one?
I think you're absolutely right about the way trauma makes children feel powerless and alone, and that they have to find a way to manage what might be really an unmanageable experience, toxic stress,
Yeah.
something that exceeds their capacity to understand and to soothe themselves from. So, left alone, if you don't have an adult to help you process it, like somebody's lap to sit on and tell them what happened and for them to comfort you, which, for example, no one in my book really had, and I think many people in our prisons didn't have. You find a way to manage for yourself. Usually that's one of two directions. Either your stress system goes on constant alert, so that you're seeing threat where it doesn't even exist around every corner. Every person who looks at you the wrong way, you think is meaning to do you harm, or you may shut down entirely and become numb to your own feelings and to the threat that may in reality exist.
Yeah.
But you have to find some way to get that traumatic experience out of the forefront of your mind in
Right.
order to function. I think you're saying that's kind of what you recall.
Yeah, I created I guess Freud would call it a superego to survive. I created, a facade until I was ready to heal it. And that, I tell people I had a choice. I could have committed suicide. I could have grown up with very low self-esteem, or I could have just put this wall up and said, these people are full of, you know what, and I'm not listening to how they see me because I was called a moron probably 3 times a week. I'm sorry to say this, but the great thing about children is we learn to adapt when we're young. We learn to kind of do it, but we don't need that stress when we're children. We need to be children. So I find this
Right.
fascinating. Uh, I'm going to tell a little story real quick, and you'll see kind of how I view things. One Christmas, I think I was around 17 or 18. My mother, she decided we were going to serve at a soup kitchen in my hometown. And back then, the Salvation Army soup kitchen was tiny. It was a little place. It was like the front of an apartment. And when I got there, we're all dressed in our Christmas clothes. My mom insisted on dressing us up. And I went to serve people, and there were so many people there from my high school who couldn't afford Christmas dinners. So they came there to eat, and they were so embarrassed when they saw me. And I let them know, hey, it's okay. We're not going to talk about this. And I would sit with them and say, hey, how you been? Blah, blah, blah. And it woke me up, Wendy, to the reality that what we see from our friends, they might be living in a pure hell that we don't know anything about, and they are depressed every day, but they put on a good face when they get to school or they get to work or wherever. It's right there, and the person that you have so much joy with at work could be going through hell right now. And,
That's right. And I think that's such a good illustration of what happens to so many kids at school who, where their difficulties that they're managing might start to show up just in truancy or in their grades
mhm,
falling. And instead of someone kind of reaching out and around
mhm,
them, very often the school response is suspension or expulsion
yeah,
when a child's performance or attendance falls down. And that's exactly what they don't need, right?
right. They need the opposite.
They
They need
need the
a they
opposite.
need a hug.
That's right.
Sometimes it's wow. You talk about this in the book. You have 2 chapters that really made me go, "Oh wow, I love how she put this." You talked about beyond the front door. That was number one, and you also talked about parental substance abuse. So go ahead. Let's talk about this beyond the front door because there's stuff going on inside. What do you do when you leave the house?
Okay, well, my point in Beyond the Front Door is that you take it with you. In other words, children cannot park the difficulties they're experiencing when they
Yeah.
leave the house and hang
Hmm.
them on a hook there to come back to later. They
Right.
are within that child as he or she goes to school, walks through the neighborhood, encounters other people, and then the things that happen outside the front door can add to difficulty or can help. And
Hmm.
it's so important to, for us as a society to be on the helpful side of that equation.
Yeah.
But for example, one young boy in my book, had a very difficult time at home. There were relatives who were in gangs. His mother had to work full time because his father was incarcerated, and he was very much on his own. And they lived in a very frightening neighborhood where he saw gun violence on his way to
Hmm.
school. So he was managing all kinds of things, both at home, on his way to school, and once he got to school, he couldn't concentrate.
Yeah.
And, it spirals downhill from there. So I think the important thing about Beyond the Front Door is both you can't leave it at home, and what do you meet on the other side? Does it help you or does it add to your difficulties?
Yeah. Is there a socioeconomic component to this? And I would, some people are listening going, well, duh. But I've met wealthy people who had it all, and they'll have 8 kids, and 3 of the sons are always getting into trouble. And you're like, well, how does that happen? And there's stuff going on there as well.
Yeah, I guess what I would say about that is there are socioeconomic factors in that when you have no money, you live in harsher neighborhoods, you may have to move more often, which can be
Yeah.
traumatic, change
Hmm.
schools more often. However, I think, as you say, we see that problematic experiences are not limited to people who don't have much. Wealthy
Right.
people experience and deliver child abuse as well. I think the Menendez brothers are a good example
Very much so.
of
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
So, it's everything together. It's kind of it's your genetics,
Yeah.
it's your early relationships, it's what kind of shape your parents are in, it's what happens to you at school,
Yeah.
it's your brain development. All these things play into it.
I think the thing that helped me the most is my grandfather was an alcoholic and he owned a bar, which isn't a good thing. My mother was an adult child of an alcoholic and she went to Al-Anon meetings and she had to deal with that trauma that came from my grandfather's, you know, things that would happen at the house when he was drunk. I grew up with my stepfather treating alcohol as a very sophisticated thing, not to be, down in this low vibration. So I never saw my stepfather drunk ever. And there was very little alcohol in the house. And so that somehow, I don't know how that did this for me, but whenever I had really bad problems, a lot of my friends would go to a bar and I wouldn't do that. I would face those problems because I learned very early on in my 20s that those things were about medicating pain. Let's talk about that a little bit because it can come in many, many forms. It can come in sex addiction, television addiction, avoidance. All these things are ways of medicating pain. Let's talk about that.
Well, in specific relationship to juvenile crime, I
Hmm.
think there are two important matters. One is addicted parents,
Hmm.
which is very problematical because children of severely addicted parents can experience a higher degree of neglect and abuse than children whose parents are not
Right.
addicted to substances. But also, children who experience trauma in childhood often, as you say, turn to drugs and alcohol because they provide relief,
Mm.
where
Yeah.
often other things don't.
Right.
And, and some of the kids in my book were exposed to using substances as early as 7 or 8 years old.
Wow.
And, when you have those experiences early on, not only do you not really understand them, but the relief feels really good, and you don't have judgment about whether this constitutes a danger to you.
Right.
Instead, it just seems like I feel better.
And I think that is what motivates a lot of people, whether they're in trauma or addiction, they just want to feel better a lot of
Yeah.
times. It's why we take a vacation. It's why we get that really sugary drink at Starbucks. We know it's not good for us. We just want to feel better in the moment. Wow. Yeah, it's so true. Um, and you don't have to go into details if you don't want to. Did you ever find someone in your study that really stood out as somebody who was really trying to get better, and understood that maybe, hey, I know I was traumatized as a kid. I want to change.
I should explain that all the people in my book were paroled or even beyond parole, and they chose to participate because they wanted to give back and, use their stories to help other people. So that's why the final chapter is called The Path to Healing, because I was fortunate in that all the people I interviewed were people who had kind of made the journey and very
Yeah.
often made it in prison, found a way to turn their lives around while incarcerated. And many of them now are active in promoting community healing, and helping young people to do things differently than they did.
I find that wonderful.
It was
That's just
wonderful.
that is wonderful.
Yeah.
I'm sitting here, I'm picturing these hardened criminals like, I just want to tell my story, but they're motivated. They're motivated
Yes.
to help others.
And some of them served 30 years in prison.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah,
they They had a long time to think about it. And many of them, when they first went to prison, they were kids and they spent the first few years, doing the same things they had done on the outside, drinking, fighting, whatever. And it was in the course of time that they encountered someone who made them see the possibility of living differently, the new laws that provided the possibility of parole to some juvenile, to juveniles who'd been sentenced to life without parole. And all these things made a difference.
yeah. Let's talk about the impact of stress. And there's got to be a trigger point. Everybody's different. I've met people who've been through severe abuse. I've read the book A Child Called It. Um, and some people, they can handle this. I'm not saying they handle it perfectly. There is something probably going on there, but there's that one individual that snaps when they've been pushed beyond the brink. I want to talk about that because figuring that out, I don't think we were ever going to be able to figure it out, but certain individuals have that ability to go through hell and back.
So maybe it's also helpful to talk about the different levels of stress.
Yes,
I
please.
mean, because we all both have and need a certain level of stress to do new things. Or,
Hmm.
the first day of school is stressful, but
Right.
it's manageable. So we all have these kind of manageable stresses that help us grow. Then we have what's called tolerable stress, which is perhaps losing, someone you love or losing a job. And what makes those manageable usually is having someone to talk about it to.
Right.
If you come home from being fired and you have no one to talk about it to, it's much harder to get past.
Right.
But the most important kind of stress for our purpose, for this discussion, I think what you're referring to is toxic stress, which
Yes.
exceeds a person's capacity to manage. And that's things like child abuse or witnessing a murder or feeling in fear of injury or death to yourself.
Right.
And again, these are things where a critical difference is whether there's an adult present for that child to help them through it. I think you're asking about people who don't have that help and
Yes.
why do some of them kind of survive in a more positive way and some survive in a more negative way or continue from there in a downward trajectory. Some of that is going to be a matter of your genetic givens, what kind of strength you have as a person. Some of it is going to be a matter of other situational features, like is there someone at some point in your life who supports you or
Hmm.
or isn't there? Do you have some kind of role model, even if they're not in your own life? For example, some one person I'm thinking of in the book who started reading during prison and was inspired by the founder of the Jesuits and his
Wow.
story, and began to think about what could he do to have a meaningful life. So your role model doesn't have to be someone you know. But if
Yeah.
there's someone you can borrow from in a way to think about life differently, that can be a big help.
Yeah. Finding someone that inspires you, a role model, someone, even someone you might see on TV, is important.
For some kids, it's one teacher who saw their potential
Yeah.
can make a huge difference, just as a teacher who humiliates you can make a huge difference.
I remember reading the book, A Child Called It. It's
Yes,
basically David Pelzer.
I'm
Uh,
familiar.
yeah. And he was so abused that the teachers, one day he came in and his mother would make him put his hands in acid, basically, and it would, chemicals to clean the house. And all the skin had been, burned off his hands. And when that happened, the teachers finally stepped in and said enough, and they got him out of that situation. They saved his life, and he went to the Air Force. He went and did all kinds of things. And I cried when I read that book because his story is what got the laws changed in California over child abuse. So I found his story incredibly touching, and he was lucky enough. I don't know what it was in him. He didn't he went to therapy like everybody else, but it didn't crush him somehow. And that moment when he had to go back and look at his mom face to face, that I was on, the edge of my seat. They should do a movie about his life. Um, but I'm still fascinated that some people can go through this, survive, and be, for lack of a better word, normal. I'm doing air quotes for those of you who are listening. Um, as opposed to acting out like the Menendez brothers, which I found,
Right.
there's a part of me that thinks they're lying. They wanted money because after they killed their parents, they went on a spending spree. But then you start to wonder, well, what if their parents were, just abusing them, hard abusing them? And I was just curious about that. Yeah, did you get a chance to talk to the Menendez brothers at all?
I have not talked to them. I've, read about them and seen the documentary that was made about them. And given my, other experiences, I am convinced that they were molested and abused.
Yeah.
And I think, also thinking about all the people I spoke with, even in the few instances where money might play some part or be in the picture, it's not
Hmm.
powerful enough to drive a child or a young person to kill someone, especially someone known to them, and
Yeah.
especially someone in their family where there are the strongest taboos, really,
Right. Right.
that we all have. So I think, being abused from the age of 6 really has an effect on your brain development and your stress response. And I think they got to a point shortly before the murders where they believed that they were going to be killed because they told their father he had to stop molesting Eric.
Yeah.
And I think they acted without real judgment, without thinking about the consequences, but purely as a kind of, over response.
Right. Well, they reached a point, I believe, where they just couldn't take it anymore. And the great thing about adulthood is you can see the bigger picture a lot of times. But when you're under trauma like that, severe violent trauma, your father's much bigger than you and
Right.
you can't stop him. How do you stop that? And I think the only answer was, we're going to kill him.
Well,
And
that's the dilemma. Also, he was larger than life to them,
oh yeah,
you
he
know,
was
and
famous. The father was, well connected, famous. Nobody would have believed them,
that's
even if
right.
they had said, "Hey, this guy's doing this to us in the privacy of our own home." So I get it. They had no way out.
But I think your point about, what accounts for the different ways people respond to the circumstances of their lives. I mean, I think about that in the context of people who are tremendously successful as well, because there's always a story behind success, just like there is behind crime.
Yeah,
And it's some people growing up in the same family become very successful where others don't. So,
yeah,
I mean, it's true that there are the individual ingredients that make a difference as
yeah.
well.
What drives you to do this work?
I'm sure initially it is the trauma in my own early life, as it is for many people,
Yeah,
you
it's
know.
true. I've never met anybody who went into psychology or psychiatry that didn't have something in their childhood that said, what, I want to help other people heal what I went through.
Right.
Yeah, so
Or it
um,
just makes you, you know, sensitive to those issues and to the pain of being a child alone with frightening experiences.
oh yeah. Well, God bless you for the work you're doing because
Oh,
you're helping people. Um, Inside every social worker I have ever met is someone with such a great heart. And our systems don't always help these people the way they could be helped. So to be there on the front lines with the kind of pay that social workers get, God bless you. It is definitely an act of service to the community. So thank you. I know
well,
you go
thank
ahead.
you for appreciating the profession of social work.
Yeah. It does start in childhood. I think it's a balance. I learned this because I've raised, three stepkids and the way my dad raised me. My dad could be, played psychological games. And, you know, the other thing is, but he also knew how to raise kids really well. That's the weird part. My dad would play these games with me, and I have a stepsister and a stepbrother who recently passed, but he knew the secret ingredient to making a kid become a successful kid. That's the weird part, and a lot of
And
times these abusers, they do have this thing where they have this one point where they're out there, but there's another part that's almost wonderful. Someone asked me
and
once, why did you hate your father? I said, because 50% of the time he was my North Star. He was the person who showed me how to activate my mind, how to control myself, how to be disciplined, how to create the life that I have, the life of meaning. I didn't just start podcasting. I've been on the radio since I was 16. And so, I had my first business at 16. So there's that factor. And I've used those positive things that my father taught me to raise three kids, who are now adults. And so
that's
there's that part where you kind of go, okay, I could hate him, but here's this other side that was loving, gentle, and tried to be a good dad. And
and
that's I
succeeded, obviously, in some ways. Yeah.
yes, I thank him every day. Um, and I asked my dad, I said, why were you so hard on me as a kid? And he goes, I wanted you to be someone. And I thought, whoa, that's a heavy answer. You put that on a 10-year-old, you know what I mean? Pressure. Um, but do you see that sometimes where there's this confusion, especially with children who've been molested by their parents? There's this confusion of it was wonderful on one end, it's horrific on the other.
That's the dilemma, that you fear the same person you love, and that you want to be close to and be loved by, and yet that person is hurting you. It's almost impossible for young children to find a way to manage that. So very often the solution is to think the badness is in the self.
Yeah. Mm.
That he's okay, my world is safe, but there's something wrong with me. And if I were just different, this wouldn't be happening.
Yeah. Or I attracted this. I brought this into my
Right.
world. And I think the hardest part is taking that childhood belief that we wrestled with and then became satisfied with our own internal answer to grow up as an adult and kind of rectify or kind of balance that feeling as a 10-year-old, let's say, or a 7-year-old, and now you're 30 and 40 years old living with it, this sort of made up answer. And I've seen it in people. I've seen little men yell at guys who are huge and muscular, and you realize the big muscular dude had been berated as a child, and here he is, he's twice the size of this guy, and he's putting up with that. It creates a loop or a habit that we begin to attract all the time. you know if our father was judgmental, we attract judgmental people into our world. If our mother was bipolar, guess who we start dating?
Yeah,
Because
I
if
think it's not so much that you attract them as that they're familiar. It
oh,
feels like, if it's comfortable even while it's uncomfortable. It
that's a
feels,
much better word. That's a much better word. I like that. Yeah. It feels comfortable.
yeah, it feels familiar.
Right. Familiarity. I
And
like that,
you
man.
you know how to operate in that world,
And when
even if
you
you don't like it very much.
and then when you heal and you enter a more functional, healthier relationship, it doesn't feel like love right away.
Yeah.
You have to readjust everything. Everything. I love it. Fascinating discussion. Thank you so much. How do we get a hold of you? What website should we go to?
Wendy B. Smith, PhD.net.
Okay. Wendy B. Smith, PhD.net. And her book is coming out soon, folks, in November of 2025, Before Their Crimes: What We're Misunderstanding About Childhood Trauma, Youth Crime, and the Path to Healing. Uh, it's fascinating. I enjoyed the um, what do they call it? It's called an early reader's copy. And I got to tell you, it's well written, and I was glued to it as soon as you talked about interviewing people in prison. I'm like, you're not just you're not just somebody who sits there and types a bunch of words. You went into the field. Were you scared at all going into the prisons?
Well, no, I wasn't scared because when I went to the prison, I was going with a group of people who had been there before and who were showing me the ropes, so to
Right,
speak. And the interviews I conducted were all, people who were out of prison. So
right.
I interviewed them in my office or by telephone. But yeah, interestingly, although I was interviewing some individuals who had committed pretty horrifying crimes, it was not frightening at all to
Yeah,
talk with them because it was it was like talking to anybody,
yeah.
about their experience.
There's a moment where they snap and then they're back to you know their
Yeah.
regular personality. They covered this in Mindhunters on Netflix when they went to interview this guy who horrifically murdered his mother. He was huge, like 6'4", 400 pounds, muscle, chunky guy, but scary. They brought him in chains, and they said, take off his chains. And he sat down with them, and they treated him like a human being. And he's sitting there at one point. This is hilarious because he turned around and he goes, "Do you want pizza? Pizza? What do you want? What do you want on your pizza?" Blah, blah, blah. And he turns to the guard, hey, Al, can you get me some pizza for these guys? And you're like, wait a minute. It's the juxtaposition of the horrific crime with the personality. He was actually a really genuine person. And when he spoke about what he did to his mother, it was a casual conversation. And it was really kind of like, interesting, how we can compartmentalize certain things in us. So I wanted to ask this. Is there male and female, is the trauma different, or is it somehow connected, or it's the same?
I don't think traumatic experience is different. I mean, if you're sexually or physically abused, it's equally terrible for
Oh,
both
yeah.
genders. And I don't think some of the responses are pretty much the same. I will say, of the people I interviewed, many of the male uh, people did end up joining gangs, which were very seductive to them as
Yeah.
substitute families, whereas none of the women
Yeah.
were involved in gangs. So that was one difference.
I was curious because I know several people in my life that were, in the MK Ultra program. They were abused at a very young age, and their parents actually enrolled them in these systems so they could get paid. Um, but I was curious about if there was a difference because women seem to handle pain and stress differently than men. So I was just kind of curious about that. And I do see why men would join gangs because men in general like to feel comfortable with other men. And when that doesn't happen, you see someone who sort of has the wounded masculine in them, if we want to use those new agey terms, but they have trouble feeling comfortable around another man. So joining a gang, it helps them feel camaraderie. They have the same, loves, hates, whatever. It makes them feel like they're part of a tribe, basically a tribe of hunters. It goes back to our days of hunter gathering. I believe I could be wrong. But yeah, fascinating discussion. Thank you for being on Awakened Nation, Dr. Wendy. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. I'm not going to let you go just yet. I do have a lightning round of questions. And if you stick around, I'll ask three and only three questions. Are you ready?
I think I'm ready.
Okay. What do you do for fun? Is my first question.
Okay. I cook. I spend time with my family. I have five grandchildren.
What? Five? That's awesome.
Um, I spend time with my husband. I read a lot of fiction. Um, I listen to music and I do physical exercise. Those are the things I enjoy most.
Because you study such a heavy topic, I had to ask if you do anything for fun. That's beautiful, though. You're a little bit of a foodie, I would imagine. That's beautiful. What's your favorite genre of fiction?
Literary fiction.
Oh, nice.
I like to read books that are substantial, both in, their meaning and their style. Um,
Wow.
for example, when I was in college, I was an English major,
Hmm.
and one of my favorite courses was the Victorian novel. So you can
Wow.
take it from
Yeah.
there.
Pride and Prejudice, things like that. Wow. Uh, my favorite is science fiction, but not, trashy science fiction. I was always this kid that, like, I read Dune at 16 because a teacher handed me the book. It's one of the most complex books probably ever written in sci-fi or anywhere. And he told me, he goes, if you can get through the first 78 pages, you'll be good because there's a dictionary in the back. So I appreciate a little bit of the escapism that comes from that. Um, my second question, in everything that you've done, um, your childhood, your family, the work you're doing, what is your favorite memory you like to go back to?
I don't think there's a single single memory. I really, when I was a therapist, I worked with so many people over long periods. I used to do long-term therapy as well as couples counseling. And, you develop such strong relationships and people allow you into their world.
Yeah.
And that was always very not only meaningful, but I felt honored to be allowed to join someone in their internal experience. So that, I think about that a lot. I also really enjoyed teaching and writing.
Yeah.
I got a lot of satisfaction when I was an instructor teaching young social workers. Um, I can't really think of anything I've done that I haven't enjoyed, you know? I I mean, I guess I'm very lucky.
You're one of those people. I love it. Yeah, I think everything you're talking about is you giving back to life. That's really what it is. And I think we find our greatest joy in serving others. Um, Not just a spiritual mission or it's your religious, it's just we find this joy when we've been through something heavy and we can help someone else lighten the load a little bit. I think that's where we find joy. We find solace, as they
I
say.
mean,
So
and that's probably why I like cooking too. I really like cooking for other people.
yeah. I love cooking too. My fiance and I, we love cooking for each other. So we try to impress each other. But the greatest fun is watching someone eat something you created and they're just like, oh my goodness, this is delicious. It's, I get
Exactly.
it. Totally get it. My last question is with this work you're doing, what is your greatest hope? For humanity or the patients or the people you've worked with? What's your greatest hope and the greatest outcome that you could see for this?
I think maybe it's that people generally would have a greater appreciation for the importance of what we provide to our children in the way of experiences.
Mhm.
And that every difference, everything that happens to a child matters. The good things matter, the bad things matter, and that if we can understand that children are very sensitive to experience. They take in everything. They don't hear just what you're saying. They hear your tone of voice and they understand that it means something and
Yeah.
has an impact on them. So I think that's really my overarching hope is that people come to understand that when children act out in negative ways, there's always a story behind it.
God bless you. Thank you so much, Dr. Wendy Smith, for being here on Awakened Nation today. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You bet. Hey, everybody, don't forget to pick up Dr. Wendy's book, Before Their Crimes: What We're Misunderstanding About Childhood Trauma, Youth Crime, and the Path to Healing. That's coming out in November this year. And don't forget, tune in next week. We're going to have another extraordinary guest here on Awakened Nation. Please like, subscribe, and leave a review on Apple Podcasts. That's how we survive. Until then, bye-bye for now. Thank you so much for being a big part of the Awakened Nation movement. This is how you can help me and our extraordinary guests. If you guys enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe and share this episode out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And let's grow this movement by word of mouth. Our success is because of you. Thank you and see you next week.